first question is pretty straightforward. You're both in the private sector, you've been in the public sector at the SEC. Tell us what's going on, especially from the regulatory standpoint. What's happening in the US and what do you envision happening in the future?
Well, thank you, Mike. It's wonderful to be with you and Emily and with the entire audience from across the world. It's wonderful to be with you. Oh, here's a few things that are happening just as a regulatory background of ESG reporting in the US. We start first with understanding that market data or the market requires data. Data as the bedrock of decision-making about the allocation of capital within the markets to companies so that they can operate and grow and compete. And so what's happening in the regulatory conversation is really a discussion about whether the right data is being provided, whether it's being provided with the right quality and rigor and in the right format. And that's important to understand really the starting point. It's one of really the market fundamentals. Do we have good information so that the marketplace can actually work? The SEC's disclosure approach really supports the market and the ability of market participants to make the decisions that power investment decisions forward. The disclosure approach is one that's integrated. It's integrated regarding the business, the key risks of a business, the business outlook, management's perspective, their discussion, their analysis, along with financial information. That integrated approach then brings together non-financial information, non-financial data, as well as financial data. And that's been true for some time, but what's of intense focus now is whether the non-financial information is maintaining pace with the changes in the marketplace. So if you look at climate, or if you look at the environment, or you look at human capital and the pandemic, or the impact of the pandemic on human capital, is the data really keeping pace? That's the context of this discussion. Maybe just one more point, Mike. ESG, I think it's important. It's important to sort of break that down into its pieces. The E, dealing with environmental type reporting, and that's wide ranging. The S, dealing with social. It might be human capital. It might be the way a company interacts with employees, customers, suppliers. And then the G, dealing with governance of the company, quality and reporting, etc. The G has over time received a lot of emphasis through proxy disclosures, executive compensation, even pay ratio disclosures, or capital structures, the importance of high quality accounting. All of that relates to the G. That's much more mature than the E or the S, although there's a lot of focused investment on the E and the S. So Mike, that's a bit of the landscape of the regulatory background, particularly for US reporting.
And just as an aside, the overseas, I know the overseas requirements seem to be more advanced. Maybe a couple quick comments on what's going on in EMEA and other jurisdictions.
Yeah, it's a great point that there's not uniformity around the globe in terms of where capital markets are, their starting point, and in some ways the destination. But there is a common denominator. Here's the common denominator. It's the focus on quality data to evaluate progress. So as companies make commitments, for example, over 1,000 companies have made net zero commitments under the UN, the United Nations standard for net zero. Over 1,000 companies have made that commitment. The common denominator is, what are the milestones? What are the metrics by which market participants can judge whether those milestones are being achieved? What are the assumptions? And then how can we together evaluate progress? How can we together evaluate whether we're on track, whether course corrections need to be made? I think that is a common denominator, whether it's the US, EMEA, or even in Asia.
Great. So we have a new administration. We have a new chair that's at least been announced. What do you see happening under the Biden administration with these with ESG?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The Biden administration campaigned on and is now talking about as part of the administration 4 key priorities. COVID response, not a surprise. The economy, also not a surprise. But also climate change and racial equity, healing some of the division and creating more unification around the way we all relate to each other. Those are 4 key priorities. I want to touch on those last 2 in particular because they map into ESG. With climate change, that maps into the E. Racial equity maps into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and human capital disclosures, that maps into the S. And so as the Biden administration has set out those priorities, they've also nominated a chair nominee, Gary Gensler. Mike, as you mentioned, Allison Lee is currently the acting chair. Gary Gensler has been nominated. We'll go through a process of advice and consent with the U.S. Senate. And what Gary has as a background is a real track record of performance at the CFTC, where he understood market structures, the way markets work, but also the way a regulator can connect with that. Of course, this audience will widely recognize Gary for the work he did on Title VII of the Dodd-Frank Act, bringing into the regulatory system an approach for derivatives that understands the importance of data and information and how it connects to priorities. And so, of course, it's impossible to know exactly where soon-to-be Chair Gensler will prioritize efforts, but I think a reasonable expectation would be to understand the importance of data, the importance of quality information to enable market participants to understand and to make the decisions they need to make. And that, of course, connects to what Acting Chair Allison Lee has spoken about, and you showed on the earlier slides. I think we'll see a line of continuity from the Biden administration's priorities through the SEC and how they engage with registrants, whether it's companies, investors, investment advisors. Great.
Now, our audience is heavily weighted to the registrant side. So I'd appreciate you giving them some advice on why ESG reporting is important to companies and any guidance you can give them about what they should be considering and doing.
The place that I really start with companies and business leaders is to really start with how the company sees its place in the operating environment. What is the business? What is the business outlook? What are the risks? And what is the data that companies are using to make decisions? That's a good starting point. That's, of course, an internal look. What is the data that we're using to make decisions? But then the second piece is also important. If we're using it, if we're communicating it to the board, what subset of that is material for external reporting? External for security holders, external for other stakeholders. Now we see companies making commitments, whether it's net zero commitments or commitments around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are important commitments, but it's also important to have data and metrics that is investment grade That is, it's prepared with good process controls and procedures, and it's in a form and a format like XBRL format for easy access and use. So the quality of the data is important. The second piece that's really important there is to really connect that reporting to the regulatory requirements. One, to understand what those requirements are. And the current requirement, which could be made much more prescriptive, but the current requirement is to communicate the material information about the business and its outlook and its operations, including with respect to liquidity and capital resources, communicate the material information to security holders. And so that's important to understand, particularly as companies produce information. Some might go on the website, some might go into an SEC filing. It's important to understand what the mandatory requirements are, as well as what the voluntary reporting is. 90% of the S&P 500 listed companies have website disclosure around sustainability, for example. Some of that, increasingly, some of that content is making its way into regulatory filings. And so this is where our audience can have a real impact on their companies. It's in understanding what that data is, what's being used, what's material, and is it in a form and a format that is useful for the marketplace? Does it need to be in an SEC filing? And does it add a sufficient degree of quality? That's the assessment conversation that I see a lot of business leaders going through at this point, Mike.
Great. And obviously we've talked about the regulatory requirements, that some are in place and some are pending or being considered. So you've got that push for the information. What else do you see driving the demand for ESG? I mean, for example, the ISS, institutional shareholders, will have ESG related disclosures that they're expecting from companies. They're not government agency. I've seen ETFs for sustainability. What would you say is really driving this?
What I see as a real driving force is that the marketplace is moving. So that impacts companies in a couple of ways. Number one, it impacts companies in the products and the services that they provide to customers, and I describe that as a top line concern. Customers care about the quality and the impact of the products and services and the companies that are offering them. That's a top line concern. But then there's also a financial concern here. What we see increasingly is a significant rise of on the investor side, a significant rise of investment funds that are organized around attributes of companies. It might be attributes related to environmental impact. It might be attributes related to a commitment for diversity and inclusion, particularly around the leadership of companies. We just saw $1 trillion, which is the high mark, but a continued upward trend, $1 trillion being organized around ESG-oriented investments. And so what that means for CFOs, what that means for those involved in external reporting, is that it matters how a company shows up in the capital markets in the ability of the company to gain access to liquidity pools designed around ESG objectives. The role of ratings firms around ESG or boutique data providers around ESG, it is really connecting companies with investors, and it's in the context of investors wanting to know more about where their investment dollars are being put to work. It's also in the context of customers and employees wanting to know more about what they're involved in. Are they buying products and services from companies whose purpose and values are aligned with theirs? Same with employees. Are they working for companies whose purpose and values are aligned with theirs? And so that's the broader context of the reporting demands that are being fed into decision-making around how the investment capital is being allocated across companies.
Great. Now, you're certainly at a firm that is providing advice and guidance. And if I'm sitting in the audience, whether I'm a reporting manager or CFO or general counsel, and there's a swirling, amount of information that's being disclosed and required and wanted, tell us what you're doing and what advisory firms like you are doing to add value to help straighten these companies out, not straighten them out, but get them to know how best to proceed.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a vibrant dialogue that we as a firm, but the public accounting profession more broadly, and the business is having in this discussion. Our purpose at PwC is to build trust in society and to solve important problems. And so our work is really focused on fostering investment grade ESG information. That is information that has a high degree of reliability and consistency and comparability to enable users of that information to make better decisions. Better information leads to better decisions. And so what do companies need to do then in relation to that? Companies need to think about their ESG data like they would financial data. They should evaluate what is being disclosed in their SEC filings, what is being disclosed on their website, if there's information on their website or in other venues, because location matters. And I guess the common denominator across that information is this: do we have data disclosed that is accurate, that is of high quality to investors and others, that can be used in a reliable way? And importantly, do we have information that's accessible and useful? And oftentimes, in order to be accessible and useful, that gets into structured data, whether it's XBRL data or other specifications. So those are some of the conversations that we're having with companies, particularly as they bring what we know from decades of practice in financial reporting. There's oftentimes no shortcuts to quality, and they're bringing that kind of lens to the preparation and reporting of non-financial information.
Great. And then the last question before I turn over to Emily, Commissioner Heron-Lee talked about the possibility of more tagging requirements, music to the ears of our audience, I'm sure. And since many of them still are wondering if all the effort put into XBRL for financial data is going to do anything positive for the ESG requirement, maybe you can help give them some idea of how XBRL would benefit the market and any stakeholder who uses SEC data when it comes to a potential ESG standards and tagging.
Thank you for that question, Mike. It's one that I know a number of us care about, and that is the benefits of XBRL reporting, the benefits of standardized, accurate data that helps increase the data accessibility and usefulness or ease of analysis. Investors and other financial market participants, as this audience knows quite well, always demand better, more timely, and less costly information on which to make their decisions. And that's because data is so fundamental to decision making, but also data comes at a cost, and so having an overall declining cost curve is something that's important to users of data, whether it's financial or non-financial. Investors have clearly been benefiting from XBRL data, although sometimes what I find is that investors and others don't realize, they're not aware that what they're consuming is XBRL data. Nonetheless, XBRL data is involved in the process of delivering data and a good experience for investors. And so one of the more recent conversations that we and others have been having around XBRL information for ESG disclosures have really been working with standard setters for non-financial information. As an example, PwC and SASB have been working together to convert the 77 SASB standards into an XBRL taxonomy. Now, that's something that the SASB will take forward. They'll go through their governance process. They'll gather input, and then market participants will over time continue to provide feedback and continue to enhance the quality of it. But the direction of travel is very much for non-financial standards to be incorporated into an XBRL taxonomy for additional reporting, additional structured information that can help level the playing field for investors and others who need data in order to inform their decisions. So those are a couple of the pieces, Mike, that we're seeing in the progress being made in this space.